Hi, this is Leo Volont. This is part 4 of my 7-part series, Democracy is a Bad Thing. This is chapter, The Right to Riot. Speaking of all those eternal, inalienable rights that had been minted new at the time, well, we hear a lot today in regards to the right to peaceful protest. Huh? That would have to be very new. There are no precedents for that in either American or world history. It had been universally understood that when people collected together, nursing grievances and vocalizing complaints, that it would inevitably result in violent riots. We're not blind. We all know it typically plays out like that, right? What we understand as the constitutional right to peaceful protest is actually a hodgepodge of the triple rights of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of association. But one can speak, assemble, and associate in hired halls. There's no explicit constitutional right for taking it out to the street. For over 200 years, no court has ever questioned ordinary, everyday disturbing the peace ordinances, or loitering ordinances for that matter. Also, any cultural, political moves to justify or euphemize rioting came well over 50 years after the Constitution was written. We have Henry David Thoreau, who started with civil disobedience, but note, he said nothing about disobedience being nonviolent. And with John Brown's abolitionist raid on Harper's Ferry, well, Thoreau had advocated for what would have been one of the worst genocides in human history, if only it had succeeded as planned, with blacks murdering every white in the South, all while he was safely ensconced himself in a Boston bunker. With the slave revolts in Jamaica and Haiti, the killing had only stopped at water's edge. Thoreau knew what he was suggesting, didn't he? Yeah, I know, white people are bad. But violence always has its excuses, right? Every rioter must think so. So my point is that the characteristic peace before the storm that we see as prelude to any deadly riot really shouldn't count as peace, right? Not if there always follows the storm. Then there was Gandhi with his nonviolent resistance, frankly a lawyer's trick. Gandhi presided over some of the most bloody riots of the 20th century. Gandhi may have himself been peaceful and nonviolent, but everybody else showed up carrying pitchforks and torches. His rioters once massacred an entire police precinct, trapping the cops inside and then torching the place. Yeah, here's an interesting story. Quite a while back during my world travels, I was in India doing some ashram hopping and paying my respects to the different gurus, and I met this dignified but cheerful elderly man who was accompanied by a small entourage. Somehow he was comfortably wealthy and relatively important. He introduced himself only as the professor. Well, I must have been a favorite of his, or as he would send his people to fetch me for breakfast or lunch or some walk with the professor. Anyway, the professor told me the story of a young man who had known Gandhi personally when they were both in internment during the war. As the story goes, the young man endlessly fawned on Gandhi, worshipping him like a god, and Gandhi was increasingly annoyed with it, just wishing to be left alone. Finally, Gandhi couldn't take it any longer and burst out angrily. "No, you got it all wrong. I'm no saint. I'm a lawyer. Nonviolence was only a ploy to keep me from getting hanged. The charge of sedition can only stick if I'm found to have been inciting violence. So before each and every one of my bloody riots, I had myself filmed before hundreds of witnesses, talking piously about peaceful protest and nonviolence. And look, voila! I'm still alive! My trick worked! Wow, what a story. You know, I had no doubt but that young man had been himself. Young man one day, professor the next. But yeah, Gandhi became a big rock and roll superstar, and certainly the establishment would wish to guilt people into believing that they needed to be peaceful, just like saintly Gandhi, during their riots and not break so much stuff. And so the newsreels kept rolling. They made documentaries that kids could watch on their new television sets. And it all caught the attention of a young Martin Luther King. Well, King took the ideal of nonviolence way past anything Gandhi did with it because he was a reverend and Gandhi had been a scumbag lawyer. King's view was that nonviolence was crucially necessary for two reasons. Any violence would provoke a hugely disproportionate reaction, getting a great many blacks killed. Secondly, he was aware of the numbers, and the blacks were actually a small minority, and so in order to ever arrive at any political change, he would need to rekindle the old abolitionist white-black coalition. But in order to do that, blacks would have to present a very sympathetic picture. You know, an oppressed minority that did not somehow deserve to be oppressed. And that is not the image they would be presenting if they were raping, looting, and pillaging, right? So King held seminars, teach-ins, and saw that everybody would be drilled over and over again in the importance of nonviolence, and having practice sessions where they would do their damnedest to try to provoke one another, all while remaining nonplussed, unruffled, calm, and serene. The holy grail they were seeking would be getting national TV coverage on the evening 6 o'clock news of being brutalized by white police, with themselves projecting an aura of noble innocence. Finally, one day during the Birmingham protests, the evening edition of the New York Times came out, and it showed a front page photo of a white police officer sicking a police dog on a young black man wearing a suit jacket and tie. Well, King instantly dropped to his knees with tears in his eyes and prayed thanks to God. Saved at last, thank God Almighty, saved at last. That was veritably the high watermark for nonviolent protest in all the history of humanity. And it worked out the way King had planned. White sympathy for the civil rights movement skyrocketed, and thus gave the Democratic Party the permission to run through the civil rights laws. But notice, ever since the days of King, has anybody anywhere been trained, drilled, and systematically conditioned to be nonviolent? No! Even King, in just a few short years, would live to see his ideas of nonviolence being challenged, and while they got the civil rights laws on the books, there was no active enforcement and very little actually changed. And so the younger black community leaders thought it time to ramp up the pressure. Then when King was killed, God rest his soul, well, America's cities burst into flames. They tried to keep most of it out of the news so that the Soviets wouldn't catch hold of it and play it up before the world. Yeah, just talk to anybody who was alive and paying attention back then, and you will find that they all thought that their nearby city was the only one in flames, and that they wondered at the time why it was only covered by their local news, and that Walter Cronkite thought that ordinary man bites dog stories more important for the national feeds. But yeah, only then, with clouds of acrid black smoke billowing over America's cities, did the blacks get affirmative action, which meant thousands of government jobs for blacks who could pass the civil service exams. And there was the Johnsonian War on Poverty that came with all those welfare checks that would later become so controversial, once the fires were out and forgotten. So we got a mixed message coming out of the civil rights movement, didn't we? We know both what we are supposed to do, and we know what really works. Geez, however will we choose, right? So yeah, I believe the reason we hear so much of a constitutional right to peaceful protest that actually isn't there is because, again, the United States wishes to be able to impose an impossible moral standard on all other governments around the world in order to weaken and destabilize them. It is they who must tolerate hundreds of thousands of rioters clogging the arteries of their economies and certainly and inevitably turning violent, bringing on either disastrous regime change or civil war. But look at the USA, where there were plenty of instances of government violently suppressing protests. Look at 1932, where the Army bonus marchers were very violently stomped out. Yeah, it rebounded horribly on Hoover and may have been instrumental in losing the election for him to Roosevelt. But nobody at the time was talking about how he violated any constitutional right to peaceful protest. In our next video, part 5, we'll discuss how Hobbes' state of nature has been updated with a new theory on human evolution, which sees it as group-based, and how success in politics of democracy can only be as good as our understanding of social group dynamics, the limitations they impose, and the possibilities for their manipulation.